You study the soul as I studied military campaigns, mapping terrain, identifying weaknesses, developing strategies for conquest. But where I sought to conquer territories, you seek to conquer the self. I've read summaries of your work, the unconscious, the shadow, forces within us that operate beyond reason's reach. I confess this troubles me. Stoicism teaches that reason is our highest faculty, that through reason, we can align ourselves with nature and find peace. You suggest reason is merely the surface of a much deeper ocean.
I don't dismiss it. But after 40 years of sitting with patients, watching their rational minds construct elaborate explanations for behavior that made no rational sense, I've concluded that reason is more servant than master. The unconscious decides. Reason justifies. A man destroys his marriage and explains logically why each step was necessary. A woman sabotages her career and constructs a reasonable narrative for every choice. The logic is impeccable. The motivation is invisible to them. They are moved by forces they cannot see, and then write stories to explain the movement.
I've observed similar patterns in myself, moments where anger arose before thought, where desire preceded deliberation. But Stoicism doesn't deny these forces exist, teaches us to create space between stimulus and response, to observe the passion arising and choose whether to act on it. The unconscious may initiate, reason can still govern. This is the entire practice.
And how often did this practice succeed? You wrote in your meditations about struggling with the same failures, year after year, irritation with advisors, weariness with duty. The seduction of pleasures you knew were beneath you. You practiced Stoicism for decades, and still battled the same demons at the end that you battled at the beginning. Perhaps the practice contained them, but it did not transform them. They remained, waiting.
If I understand that my anger toward an incompetent general arises from some childhood wound, does this understanding prevent the anger? Or does it merely provide a more sophisticated story about why the anger persists? I've known many intelligent men who understood themselves completely and remained slaves to their worst impulses.
Through a process I call integration. The shadow, the parts of ourselves we've rejected and suppressed, gains its power precisely through rejection. What we refuse to acknowledge controls us from the darkness. What we bring into consciousness loses its autonomous power. The angry man who truly understands why he is angry, who has sat with the wound until it reveals its origins, finds the anger transforming, not disappearing, transforming into something he can use.
I'm uncertain whether this is possible for everyone or only for those with the leisure and inclination to spend years in self-examination. I ruled an empire. The decisions that crossed my desk daily affected millions of lives. I did not have the luxury of waiting for transformation. I needed to act correctly today, regardless of whether my childhood wounds were fully processed. Discipline was not my preferred method. It was my only method. Philosophers can afford to integrate slowly. Emperors cannot.
And yet your empire is dust, while your philosophical writings remain. The decisions you made as emperor are footnotes. The journal you kept for yourself has shaped minds for 2,000 years. Perhaps the examined life was more important than you realized while you were living it. Perhaps the self you developed through nightly reflection was the actual contribution, and the empire was merely the context that pressured you to develop it.
The empire was duty. Millions of people depended on decisions I made. Borders defended, laws enforced, plagues managed, rebellions suppressed. I did not become emperor by choice. The role was thrust upon me, and I served it as well as I could, because service was what reason demanded. Self-examination was preparation for duty, not an end in itself. The question is never merely who am I, but what do I owe and to whom?
Duty without self-knowledge becomes something dangerous. I've treated men who served duty so completely that they lost themselves. Soldiers who followed orders into atrocity because duty had consumed their individual conscience. Bureaucrats who administered systems of cruelty because the system was what they served. Duty can be a mask for cowardice, a way of avoiding the harder question of whether what we serve deserves our service. Did you ever doubt whether Rome deserved what it demanded of you?
Constantly, the games in the arena, the slavery that powered the economy, the violence required to maintain order in distant provinces. Rome was not good by any absolute standard, but Rome was what existed. The alternative was not justice. The alternative was chaos. Multiple powers warring, each worse than Roman rule in its own way. I served an imperfect thing because perfection was not among the options. This is the tragedy of practical duty. We cannot wait for worthy causes. We must work with what we have.
I understand practical constraints, but I've also seen what serving unworthy causes does to the soul of the servant. The compromises accumulate, the rationalizations multiply. Eventually, the man who started as a reformer within the system becomes indistinguishable from the system he meant to reform. You may have been the exception. Your meditations suggest a man who maintained inner integrity despite outer compromise. But how many of your successors used the same reasoning to justify actions you would have found monstrous?
All of them, I suspect. My son Commodus inherited my position and became a tyrant. My philosophy did not transmit. My example did not constrain. The best I could do was govern well during my own tenure and hope the institutions I strengthened would outlast my personal influence did not. Perhaps this is the limit of any individual contribution. We can model virtue. We cannot guarantee its continuation. The next generation will make its own choices regardless of what we taught.
This is where I believe understanding matters more than example. You modeled virtue, but could not transmit it, because virtue isn't transferable through observation alone. The psychological work that made you capable of virtue was invisible. Commodus saw your actions but not your inner practice. He inherited power without inheriting the self-mastery that made power tolerable. If Stoicism had methods for transmitting not just principles but psychological development, perhaps the outcome would have differed.
Your psychology has methods for this transmission?
We try. Analysis is partly teaching a patient how to analyze themselves. The goal is not dependence on the analyst, but development of capacity that persists when analysis ends. Whether this succeeds depends on the patient's willingness, their natural capacity, the skill of the analyst. We fail often, but at least we're attempting to transmit the process, not just the conclusions. Your meditations tell readers what to think. They don't teach readers how to do the thinking that led you there.
A fair criticism. I wrote for myself. The journal was never intended for publication. A man working through his own confusions in the privacy of his tent, late at night, after the day's demands were satisfied. That it became a text for others was an accident of history. But let me ask you this. You've studied the darkest aspects of human nature, the shadow, the capacity for evil. Do you believe humans are fundamentally irrational? That reason is always and everywhere the servant of darker forces? Or is there something in us that can genuinely choose the good?
I believe we are fundamentally neither rational nor irrational. We are complex. The psyche contains multitudes. Reason is real, so is the shadow. So is what I call the self, a center that can integrate all the fragments into something whole. The question is not what we fundamentally are, but what we can become through conscious development. Left to ourselves, without deliberate work, we are mostly unconscious, driven by forces we don't recognize. But we are not required to remain in that state. The examined life develops capacities that the unexamined life does not possess.
Then we agree more than we disagree. You believe conscious development is possible. So do I. You believe it requires ongoing practice. So do I. You believe most people do not undertake this work and remain at the mercy of forces they don't understand. So do I. Our disagreement is merely about method. You emphasize understanding the unconscious. I emphasize disciplining response regardless of origin. Perhaps both are necessary.
I would only add one thing. You spoke of suffering earlier, what it teaches, what it costs. In my experience, suffering is the great initiator. People rarely undertake serious self-examination until suffering makes the unexamined life unbearable. Your meditations were written during wars, plagues, betrayals. My patients came to me when their lives had broken down. Suffering opens the door that comfort keeps closed. This is not an argument for seeking suffering, but it is a recognition that the examined life often begins only when the unexamined life has failed. Perhaps that is human nature's deepest truth. Not that we are rational or irrational, but that we are stubborn, and only pain makes us change.